The merciless sun had been beating down on Dustwood Creek for 3 weeks straight when the storm finally came. Not the gentle rain the farmers had been praying for, but a violent dust devil that tore through the main street like the devil himself was riding it. Windows rattled, horses whinnied in terror, and every soul in town took shelter behind whatever walls they could find. When the wind finally died down and the dust settled, Sheriff Tom Bradley was the first to emerge from the jailhouse. He squinted through the haze, checking for damage, when he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. Crying. Not the wailing of an injured adult, but the desperate sobbing of a child. There, in the middle of Main Street, sat a small figure no more than 6 years old. The child's clothes were torn and dusty, dark hair matted with dirt, clutching something small and broken in tiny hands. Boy or girl, Tom couldn't tell at first glance, but the terror in those wide eyes was unmistakable. "Hey there, little one," Tom called softly, approaching slowly like he would a spooked horse. "You hurt?" The child looked up but said nothing, just held that broken trinket tighter, what looked like half of a wooden horse, split clean down the middle. By now, other townspeople had emerged. Martha Henley from the general store, Doc Peterson, even old Jake from the saloon. They formed a loose circle around the child, murmuring among themselves. "Where'd this one come from?" Martha whispered, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for unwelcome surprises. "Storm must have blown him in from somewhere," Doc Peterson offered, kneeling down to examine the child for injuries. "Can't see any wounds, but they're scared half to death." "What's your name, child?" Sheriff Bradley asked gently. "Where are your folks?" The child's only response was to shake their head and clutch that broken toy horse even tighter. As word spread through town, more people gathered. The blacksmith, the banker, the preacher's wife, all staring down at this small, lost soul like they were looking at a puzzle they couldn't solve. And with each passing minute, the whispers grew louder and more pointed. "Probably a runaway," someone muttered. "Could be trouble," another voice added. "Kids don't just appear out of nowhere. Maybe we should send word to the next town over, see if anyone's missing a child." But as the suggestions flew, nobody stepped forward to actually help. Nobody offered to take the child in, even temporarily. They all had their reasons. Martha was a spinster who wouldn't know what to do with a child. Doc Peterson was too old. The preacher's wife already had 5 of her own. The truth was simpler and uglier. They were afraid. Afraid of responsibility, afraid of the unknown, afraid of what this child might bring into their carefully ordered lives. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the child remained sitting in the dust, still crying softly. The crowd had thinned as people returned to their evening routines, leaving only Sheriff Bradley and a few others. "Can't just leave the child here all night," Doc Peterson said, though his tone suggested he wasn't volunteering for guardian duty. "Orphanage in Silver Ridge is 3 days' ride," the sheriff replied. "Could take 'em there come morning." "3 days?" Martha scoffed. "And who's going to watch the child tonight? I've got inventory to do." That's when they heard the slow, steady clip-clop of horse hooves on the dusty street. Every head turned toward the sound, and the remaining crowd unconsciously took a step back. It was him, the Loner Cowman. Nobody knew his real name. He'd never offered it, and nobody had ever asked. He'd drifted into Dustwood Creek about 2 years ago, bought a small piece of land on the outskirts of town with cash, and kept to himself ever since. He was a man of maybe 45, with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 regrets. His face was scarred, a jagged line running from his left temple to his jaw, and he rarely spoke more than a few words to anyone. The townspeople tolerated him because he caused no trouble and paid his bills. but they didn't trust him. There was something about his silence, his isolation, that made them nervous. Some said he was running from the law. Others whispered he'd done terrible things in his past. All they knew for certain was that he was dangerous. You could see it in the way he carried himself, in the practiced ease with which he wore his gun. Now he sat atop his old brown mare, looking down at the scene before him. His dark eyes moved from the child to the assembled townspeople, and something flickered across his face. Disappointment, maybe, or disgust. "Evening," Sheriff Bradley said carefully. The cowman had never caused trouble, but Tom had learned to be cautious around men who kept their own counsel. The cowman didn't respond to the greeting. Instead, he dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He approached the child with the same careful movements Sheriff Bradley had used earlier, but there was something different in his manner, a gentleness that surprised everyone watching. "Hey there," he said, his voice rough from disuse but surprisingly warm. "That's a fine horse you got there." For the first time since the storm, the child looked up with something other than fear. Those small fingers loosened slightly around the broken toy. The cowman knelt down in the dust, bringing himself to the child's eye level. "Mind if I take a look?" Slowly, hesitantly, the child extended the broken wooden horse. The cowman examined it carefully, turning the pieces over in his large, calloused hands. "This here's good craftsmanship," he said seriously, as if he were appraising a fine piece of art. "Whoever made this knew what they were doing. See these markings here?" He pointed to tiny carved details in the wood. "That's the work of someone who cared." The child nodded and for the first time spoke. Just a whisper, but audible. "Papa made it." A collective intake of breath from the watching crowd. The cowman's expression didn't change, but his voice became even gentler. "Your papa sounds like a good man. What happened to your horse here?" "Storm," the child whispered. "Everything broke in the storm." The cowman nodded gravely, as if this were the most important conversation he'd ever had. "Storms can be mighty fierce, but you know what? Sometimes broken things can be fixed. Sometimes they come back even stronger." He stood up slowly, the broken toy horse still in his hands. Then he did something that shocked everyone present. He scooped the child up in his arms as easily as if they weighed nothing at all. "What are you doing?" Sheriff Bradley demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. The cowman looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "What none of you had the courage to do." "Now wait just a minute." Martha Henley stepped forward. "You can't just take that child. We don't know anything about you, and we sure don't know anything about where that child came from." "That's right," Doc Peterson added. "Could be dangerous. Could be what?" The cowman's voice cut through their protests like a blade. "A child in need? Someone who needs help?" His gaze swept over the assembled townspeople, and several of them looked away. "Seems to me that's exactly what it is." He turned and walked toward his horse, the child still in his arms. The little one had stopped crying and was looking around with wide, curious eyes. "You can't just ride off with that child," Sheriff Bradley called out, his voice rising. "I won't allow it." The cowman paused and turned back. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly in the evening air. "Then what do you suggest, Sheriff? Leave the child here in the street? Pass them around like an unwanted burden until someone else deals with the problem?" Tom Bradley opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The truth was, he didn't have a better solution, and everyone knew it. "I'll bring the child back," the cowman said simply, "when I know they're safe." "And when will that be?" Martha demanded. The cowman lifted the child onto his horse, then swung up behind them. "When it's time." Without another word, he urged his horse forward. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the unlikely pair rode slowly down Main Street, past the saloon, past the church, past the last houses on the edge of town, until they disappeared into the gathering darkness. As the dust settled behind them, the townspeople stood in uncomfortable silence. Each of them was thinking the same thing, though none would say it aloud. They had just watched their most feared resident do what none of them had been willing to do. "Well," Sheriff Bradley finally said, breaking the silence, "I suppose we'll see what comes of this." But as he walked back toward the jailhouse, Tom Bradley couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, something that would change Dustwood Creek forever. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered a question that would haunt him for days to come. What if they were wrong about the Loner Cowman? What if they had been wrong about everything? 3 days had passed since the Loner Cowman disappeared with the mysterious child, and Dustwood Creek was buzzing with speculation like a disturbed beehive. Every conversation in every establishment seemed to circle back to the same questions. Who was that child? What did the Cowman want with them? And most troubling of all, would either of them ever be seen again? Sheriff Tom Bradley sat in his office, staring at the wanted posters on his wall without really seeing them. He'd sent telegrams to 3 neighboring towns asking about missing children, but so far, no responses. It was as if the child had materialized out of thin air, carried in by that dust storm like some kind of omen. The door to his office creaked open, and Martha Henley stepped inside without knocking, a liberty she took as one of the town's founding families. "Any word?" she asked, settling her considerable bulk into the chair across from his desk. "Nothing yet," Tom replied, leaning back in his chair. "But it's only been 3 days, Martha. These things take time." "Time!" Martha snorted. "Meanwhile, that man could be doing God knows what with that poor child. We should have stopped him, Tom. Should have arrested him on the spot." "On what charges?" Tom asked wearily. They'd had this conversation twice already. Taking in a child that nobody else wanted? Providing shelter to someone in need? "You know what I mean." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper, though they were alone in the office. "We don't know anything about his past. For all we know, he could be one of those types who prey on children." Tom Bradley had been sheriff of Dustwood Creek for 15 years, and in that time, he'd learned to read people pretty well. The Loner Cowman was dangerous, yes, but not in the way Martha was suggesting. There was violence in the man's past. Tom was certain of it, but it wasn't the kind that targeted the innocent. "I think you're wrong about him," Tom said quietly. Martha's eyes widened. "Wrong? Tom Bradley, that man is trouble. Has been since the day he rode into town. Remember what happened at Jake's saloon?" Tom remembered. About 6 months after the cowman had arrived, a group of drifters had come through town, the kind of men who made their living with their guns and their fists. They'd been drinking heavily and causing trouble, harassing the saloon girls and picking fights with anyone who looked at them sideways. The cowman had been sitting alone at his usual table in the corner, nursing a single whiskey and minding his own business. But when one of the drifters had grabbed young Sally Mae and wouldn't let go despite her protests, the cowman had stood up. What happened next was over so fast that most people missed it. One moment the drifter was pawing at Sally Mae, the next he was on the floor with a broken nose and the cowman's boot on his chest. The other drifters had reached for their guns, but somehow, nobody could quite explain how, the cowman's Colt was already in his hand, steady as a rock and pointed right at them. "I suggest you boys finish your drinks and move along," he'd said in that quiet voice of his. "This town's got enough trouble without you adding to it." They'd left, all of them, including the one with the broken nose, and they'd never come back. "He protected Sally Mae," Tom pointed out. "Stood up for her when nobody else would. That's different. Martha waved a dismissive hand. That was just keeping the peace. This is a child we're talking about. An innocent, defensible child. Before Tom could respond, the door burst open again. This time it was Doc Peterson, looking more agitated than Tom had seen him in years. "Tom, you need to hear this," the old doctor said, slightly out of breath. "I've been asking around, doing some digging about that child, and I think I might know where they came from." Martha leaned forward eagerly. "Where?" Doc Peterson glanced around nervously, then closed the door behind him. "You remember the Hartwell family? Had a small ranch about 20 miles north of here, up in the hills?" Tom frowned, searching his memory. "Vaguely. Haven't heard that name in, must be 3, 4 years now." "That's because they're all dead," Doc Peterson said grimly. "Whole family wiped out by raiders. Happened about 4 years ago. House burned to the ground, livestock scattered or stolen. I heard about it from a traveling merchant, but it was so far out of our jurisdiction." "What does this have to do with the child?" Martha demanded. "The Hartwells had a little one, about the right age, and—" Doc Peterson paused, swallowing hard. "And the father was known for his woodworking. Made toys for his child. Beautiful work from what I heard." The silence in the office was deafening. Tom felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "You're saying that child has been alone for 4 years?" he asked quietly. "I'm saying it's possible," Doc Peterson replied. "Think about it. Child that age, traumatized, probably doesn't even remember their real name. Could have been wandering, surviving however they could. Maybe taken in by someone, maybe not. And that storm, it could have blown them here from anywhere." Martha's face had gone pale. 4 years? A child alone for 4 years? "It would explain why they don't talk much," Doc Peterson continued. "Why they're so scared, and why they cling to that broken toy horse. It might be the only thing they have left of their family." Tom Bradley stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to ride out to where the Hartwell place used to be, see if I can find any evidence." "Tom, that's a day's ride each way," Martha protested. "And what if the cowman comes back while you're gone?" "Then you'll handle it," Tom replied, already reaching for his hat. "But I need to know the truth about this child. If what Doc Peterson is suggesting is right, then—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what he was thinking. If the child was indeed the lone survivor of the Hartwell massacre, then they had all stood by and watched a traumatized orphan sit crying in the street while they debated what to do with them. And the Loner Cowman, the man they all feared and distrusted, had been the only one with the decency to help. As Tom prepared to leave, Doc Peterson caught his arm. "There's something else, Tom. Something I probably should have mentioned before." "What?" The old doctor looked uncomfortable. "I've been thinking about the cowman, about when he first came to town. The timing, it was right around the same time as the Hartwell massacre, maybe a few months after." Tom felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Doc Peterson said quickly. "Just, it's a coincidence, that's all. Probably nothing." But as Tom Bradley rode out of Dustwood Creek that morning, heading north toward the ruins of the Hartwell Ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were no coincidences in this story. Everything was connected somehow. The child, the storm, the cowman, and the tragedy that had happened 4 years ago. Meanwhile, back in town, the whispers were growing louder. Jake the bartender was telling anyone who'd listen that he'd always known there was something wrong with the cowman. The preacher's wife was organizing prayer circles for the poor lost child, and Martha Henley was making plans to form a search party if the sheriff didn't return with answers soon. But in the general store, young Sally Mae, The same girl the cowman had protected months earlier was having a very different conversation with her friend Emma. "I don't care what everyone's saying," Sally Mae whispered as she swept the floor. "That man saved me from those drifters. He's not what people think he is." "But Sally," Emma replied, "what if he really did take that child? What if—" "Then he did it for a good reason," Sally Mae interrupted. "I saw his face when he looked at that child. It wasn't the face of a man planning something evil. It was sad. Like he understood something the rest of us didn't." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" Sally Mae paused in her sweeping, staring out the window toward the edge of town where the cowman had disappeared 3 days earlier. "I mean, maybe he knows what it's like to be alone and scared. Maybe he knows what it's like to need help and have everyone turn away." As the sun set on Dustwood Creek that evening, the town was divided into two camps: those who believed the cowman was a dangerous criminal who had kidnapped an innocent child, and those who were beginning to wonder if they had misjudged the silent stranger who had lived among them for 2 years. But 20 miles north, in the ruins of what had once been the Hartwell family ranch, Sheriff Tom Bradley was making a discovery that would change everything. Hidden beneath the charred remains of the main house, he found a small wooden box that had somehow survived the fire. Inside the box were papers, birth certificates, family photographs, and a letter written in a woman's careful handwriting. A letter that began, "If anything should happen to us, please know that our child's name is Jessie, and they are the light of our lives." As Tom read the letter by lamplight, his hands trembling slightly, he realized that the mystery was deeper than any of them had imagined. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the Loner Cowman was caring for a child who had lost everything, a child whose story was about to turn the town of Dustwood Creek upside down. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode back into Dustwood Creek just as the morning sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink. He'd been gone for 2 days, and the exhaustion showed in every line of his weathered face. But it was the expression in his eyes that made people stop and stare as he passed, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and something that looked like shame. Word spread quickly that the sheriff had returned, and by the time Tom had stabled his horse and walked to his office, a small crowd had gathered outside. Martha Henley was there, of course, along with Doc Peterson, Jake from the saloon, and several other prominent townspeople. "Well," Martha demanded before Tom had even reached his door, "what did you find?" Tom paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked at the expectant faces surrounding him, and for a moment he considered telling them to wait, to let him collect his thoughts first. But the weight of what he'd discovered was too heavy to carry alone. "The child's name is Jessie Hartwell," he said quietly, and everything Doc Peterson suspected was true. The crowd erupted in murmurs and gasps, but Tom held up a hand for silence. "There's more," he continued, his voice heavy, "and I think you all need to hear it. Come inside." They filed into the small office, cramming themselves into the available space. Tom sat heavily behind his desk and pulled out the wooden box he'd found in the ruins. "The Hartwell family was murdered 4 years ago," he began, his voice steady but strained. "Mother, father, and 2 older children, but there was a 3rd child, Jessie, who was only 2 years old at the time. The bodies of the parents and older children were found, but Jessie was never found." "My God," Doc Peterson whispered. "That child has been alone for 4 years?" "Not alone," Tom said grimly. "That's where this story gets complicated." He pulled a photograph from the box, a family portrait showing a man, woman, and 3 children standing in front of a modest ranch house. "This is the Hartwell family, and this," he pointed to a tall man standing beside the father, "is their ranch foreman." The photograph was old and slightly faded, but the face was unmistakable. Even without the scar, even with a smile instead of the perpetual grimness they all knew. It was clearly the Loner Cowman. The silence in the room was deafening. "His name is Marcus Cole," Tom continued, "and according to the letters I found, he was more than just an employee to the Hartwells. He was family, trusted, loved, and when the raiders came..." Tom's voice trailed off. "What happened?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom pulled out another document, a letter written in a shaky, desperate hand. This was written by Mrs. Hartwell during the attack. She managed to hide it before the end. It says that Marcus tried to fight them off, but there were too many. He was shot, left for dead. But before he lost consciousness, he saw Mrs. Hartwell hide little Jessie in a root cellar. "So he knew," Doc Peterson said slowly. "He knew the child was alive." "More than that," Tom replied. "When he came to, the house was burning, and the raiders were gone. He pulled himself to the root cellar and found Jessie, traumatized, barely alive, clinging to that wooden horse their father had made. Marcus took the child, and they've been together ever since." The implications of this revelation hit the room like a physical blow. For 4 years, while they had whispered about the dangerous stranger in their midst, he had been caring for a traumatized child. For 4 years, while they had speculated about his dark past, he had been the only family that little Jessie had left. "But why didn't he tell anyone?" Martha asked, though her voice had lost its earlier accusatory tone. "Why keep it secret?" Tom looked at her sadly. "Think about it, Martha. A man with a scarred face and a violent past shows up in town with a child who isn't his. What would people assume? What would you have assumed?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. They all knew the answer. "He was protecting the child." Sally Mae's voice came from the doorway. She had been listening from outside and had quietly slipped in during Tom's explanation. "He knew that if people found out, they'd take Jessie away, put them in an orphanage or with strangers. He couldn't let that happen." "But that's kidnapping," Martha protested weakly. "Even if his intentions were good." "Were they?" Tom interrupted. "Good intentions?" He pulled out the final document from the box, a legal paper, official and stamped. "This is Marcus Cole's appointment as Jessie's legal guardian, signed by both parents before their death. It's all legal, Martha. He didn't kidnap anyone. He's been Jessie's guardian all along." The room fell silent again, as the full weight of their misjudgment settled over them. For 2 years they had treated Marcus Cole with suspicion and fear. They had whispered about him, avoided him, made him feel unwelcome in their community, and all the while he had been doing exactly what any good parent would do, protecting his child. "There's something else," Tom said quietly, "something that makes this even worse." He looked around the room at the assembled faces. 3 days ago, when that storm brought Jessie into town, it wasn't random. Jessie had run away. "Run away?" Doc Peterson asked. "Why?" Tom's voice was heavy with emotion. "Because they heard the whispers. They heard people in town talking about their guardian, saying he was dangerous, saying he was someone to be feared. Jessie was trying to protect Marcus the only way they knew how, by leaving. The silence that followed was crushing. Each person in that room was remembering their own words, their own whispered conversations about the Loner Cowman. They were remembering how they had made a traumatized child feel so unwelcome that running away seemed like the only option. "That's why Jessie wouldn't talk at first," Sally Mae said softly. "They were scared of us. And Marcus," Martha whispered, her face pale. "When he took Jessie that night, he was taking his child home," Tom finished. "Where they belonged. Where they'd always belonged." Jake the bartender, who had been silent throughout the entire revelation, finally spoke up. "So what do we do now?" It was a good question. How do you apologize for 4 years of misjudgment? How do you make amends for driving a family to the point where a child felt they had to run away to protect their guardian? "We wait," Tom said simply. "Marcus said he'd bring Jesse back when it was time, when they felt safe, and when they do." He looked around the room at each face. "When they do, we'd better be ready to welcome them home properly." As the crowd began to disperse, each person lost in their own thoughts about what they had learned, Sally May lingered behind. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "do you think they'll come back after everything that's happened?" Tom Bradley looked out the window toward the edge of town, where the road disappeared into the hills. Somewhere out there, a man was trying to heal a child's broken heart while nursing his own wounds that the people of Dustwood Creek had helped to inflict. "I don't know, Sally," he admitted. "I honestly don't know, but I hope so, because this town needs them more than they need us." Meanwhile, 20 miles away in a small cabin hidden in the hills, Marcus Cole was sitting by a fireplace, carefully gluing together the two halves of a wooden horse. Jesse sat beside him, watching intently as their guardian worked to repair the toy that meant so much to them both. "Will it be strong again?" Jesse asked quietly. Marcus looked down at the child he had raised, the child he had protected, the child who had become his whole world. "Stronger," he promised. "Sometimes when something breaks and gets put back together, it's stronger than it was before." Jesse nodded solemnly, then leaned against Marcus's side. "Are we going back to town?" Marcus paused in his work, considering the question. He thought about the fear in the townspeople's eyes, the whispers that followed him wherever he went, the way Jesse had absorbed all of that negativity until they felt they had to run away. But he also thought about Sally May, who had always smiled at them both, about Doc Peterson, who had treated Jesse's scraped knees without asking questions, about Sheriff Bradley, who had always been fair even when others weren't. "Maybe," Marcus said finally, "when we're both ready, when we're both strong enough." Jesse nodded and settled more comfortably against their guardian's side. Outside, the wind was picking up again, but inside the cabin, they were safe. They were together. And for now, that was enough. But in Dustwood Creek, the real work was just beginning, because the townspeople were about to learn that redemption isn't just about the person seeking it. It's about the community willing to offer it. 2 weeks had passed since Sheriff Bradley's revelation, and Dustwood Creek had become a town transformed by guilt and determination. The change was subtle at first. Conversations that stopped when certain names were mentioned, people going out of their way to help neighbors they'd previously ignored, a general atmosphere of reflection and regret. Martha Henley had surprised everyone by organizing a collection for the Hartwell family, as she now insisted on calling Marcus and Jesse. Doc Peterson had quietly spread the word that if anyone saw the pair returning, they should be welcomed, not questioned. Even Jake had put up a sign in his saloon. "The Cole family drinks free." But it was Sally May who had done something truly extraordinary. She had convinced her father to let her use the back room of the general store to create something special. A workshop where she spent every evening after closing time, working by lamplight on a project that she kept secret from everyone except Sheriff Bradley. "You sure about this, Sally?" Tom asked one evening as he stopped by to check on her progress. "It's a lot of work for something that might never be needed." Sally May looked up from the delicate carving she was working on, her young face determined. "It'll be needed, Sheriff. They're coming back. I can feel it." Tom hoped she was right. The town had been holding its collective breath for 2 weeks, waiting for some sign that Marcus and Jesse were ready to return. But as the days passed with no word, Some people were beginning to wonder if they had lost their chance at redemption entirely. That's when the stranger rode into town. He was a weathered man in his 60s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent his life working with his hands. He rode directly to the sheriff's office and introduced himself as Samuel Hartwell, Jesse's grandfather. "I got word about what happened here," he explained to Tom, his voice heavy with emotion. "About my grandchild being found. About Marcus. I came as soon as I could." Tom's heart sank. "Mr. Hartwell, I should explain—" "No need," Samuel interrupted gently. "I know the whole story. Marcus sent me a letter. Told me everything that happened, everything he's been doing for Jesse these past 4 years." The old man's eyes filled with tears. "That boy, Marcus, he saved my grandchild's life. And from what I hear, this town nearly drove them both away." Tom nodded shamefully. "We made mistakes, Mr. Hartwell. Big ones, but we're trying to make things right." Samuel studied the sheriff's face for a long moment. "Are you? Because Marcus and Jesse are about a day's ride behind me. They're coming back, but they're scared. Jesse's scared of being rejected again, and Marcus is scared of what this town might do to Jesse if they stay." "They won't be rejected," Tom said firmly. "I can promise you that." "Can you?" Samuel asked. "Can you promise that a traumatized child will be welcomed by people who once saw them as a burden? Can you promise that Marcus will be treated as the hero he is, instead of the villain you all thought he was?" Before Tom could answer, the door burst open, and Sally Mae rushed in, her face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff! Mr. Hartwell!" She stopped short when she saw the stranger, then looked between him and Tom. "Is this—" "Jesse's grandfather," Tom confirmed. Sally Mae's face lit up. "Oh, this is perfect. You have to come see what we've been working on. The whole town's been preparing for when they come back." Samuel looked skeptical, but Sally Mae was already pulling him toward the door. "Please, just come look. You need to see this." Reluctantly, Samuel followed Sally Mae and Tom out of the office and down Main Street. As they walked, Tom noticed that other townspeople were emerging from their shops and homes, as if word had somehow spread that something important was happening. Sally Mae led them to the general store and around to the back entrance. "Close your eyes," she instructed Samuel. "Both of you." "Sally, what are you—" Tom began. "Just trust me," she said firmly. Puzzled but willing to humor her, both men closed their eyes. Sally Mae opened the door and guided them inside. "Okay," she said softly. "You can look now." Tom opened his eyes and gasped. The back room of the general store had been completely transformed. The walls were painted in warm, welcoming colors, and the space had been divided into 2 areas, a living space with comfortable furniture and a workshop area with tools and workbenches. But it was the details that took Tom's breath away. Handmade quilts covered the bed and chairs, shelves lined the walls, filled with books, toys, and supplies. And everywhere, on the walls, on the shelves, carved into the wooden furniture, were horses. Dozens of them, each one unique, each one crafted with obvious love and care. "The whole town helped," Sally Mae explained, her voice proud but nervous. "Martha donated the fabric for the quilts. Doc Peterson provided medical supplies. Jake contributed furniture from the saloon storage room. The blacksmith made tools for the workshop. Even the preacher's wife helped with the sewing." Samuel walked slowly through the space, his weathered hands touching the carved horses, the soft quilts, the carefully arranged books. When he turned back to face them, tears were streaming down his cheeks. "This is for Jesse?" he whispered. "For both of them," Sally Mae corrected. "Marcus, too. We know they've been living rough, moving around, never having a real home. We hoped—" Maybe they'd like to have a place where they belonged. But the general store, Tom began. My father's been wanting to expand anyway, Sally Mae interrupted. He's going to build a new addition out front. This space was just going to waste. She paused, looking suddenly uncertain. Do you think they'll like it? Samuel couldn't speak for a moment. He just stood there, overwhelmed by the generosity and thoughtfulness of what the town had created. Finally, he found his voice. It's beautiful, he said simply. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. As word spread through town that Jesse's grandfather had arrived and seen their surprise, people began gathering outside the general store. Martha Henley arrived with a basket of fresh bread. Doc Peterson brought a medical kit, just in case. Jake showed up with a bottle of his finest whiskey for the adults and a jar of penny candy for the young one. By evening, it seemed like the entire population of Dustwood Creek had assembled on Main Street, all of them waiting and watching the road that led out of town. Think they'll really come tonight? Martha asked nervously. Marcus said they would, Samuel replied. He's a man of his word. As if summoned by his words, a figure appeared on the horizon, a lone rider on horseback, moving slowly toward town. As the figure drew closer, they could see it was actually two people on one horse, a tall man with a scarred face and a small child sitting in front of him. The crowd fell silent as Marcus Cole and Jesse Hartwell rode down Main Street. Marcus's eyes swept over the assembled townspeople, wary and alert, ready to turn and ride away at the first sign of hostility. But there was no hostility. Instead, people began to step forward, one by one, removing their hats, nodding respectfully, some even smiling. When Marcus reached the general store, Sheriff Bradley stepped forward. "Welcome home, Marcus," he said simply. "Welcome home, Jesse." Jesse looked around at all the faces that had once seemed cold and unwelcoming but now showed only warmth and acceptance. Then they saw their grandfather standing in the crowd, and their face lit up with joy. "Grandpa!" Jesse cried, sliding down from the horse and running into Samuel's arms. As grandfather and grandchild embraced, Marcus remained on his horse, still uncertain. That's when Sally Mae stepped forward. "We have something to show you," she said softly. "Both of you, if you'd like to see it." Marcus looked down at the young woman who had always been kind to them, then at the crowd of people who had once made him feel like an outsider. Slowly, he dismounted. "Lead the way," he said quietly. What happened next would be talked about in Dustwood Creek for generations to come. When Marcus and Jesse saw what the town had created for them, their new home, filled with love and care and carved horses, Jesse burst into tears of joy, and Marcus did something no one had ever seen him do. He smiled. Not the grim, guarded expression they were used to, but a real smile that transformed his entire face and made him look years younger. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all." But the surprises weren't over yet. As the crowd began to disperse and the family prepared to settle into their new home, Sally Mae pulled out one final gift, a wooden horse, perfectly carved and painted, but deliberately left with a visible seam where two pieces had been joined together. "It's like you said," she told Marcus as she handed the horse to Jesse. "Sometimes when something breaks and gets put back together, it's stronger than it was before." Jesse clutched the horse to their chest, their eyes shining. "It's beautiful," they whispered. "Just like our family," Marcus said, putting his arm around Jesse's shoulders and reaching out to shake Samuel's hand. "Just like our town." As the sun set over Dustwood Creek that night, 3 generations of the Hartwell family sat in their new home, surrounded by the love and acceptance of a community that had learned the true meaning of redemption. Outside, The wind blew gently through the streets, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and second chances. The Loner Cowman was no longer alone. Jesse was no longer lost. And Dustwood Creek had learned that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who need heroes themselves. In the end, they had all saved each other. And in the workshop behind the general store, Marcus Cole began teaching his child and father-in-law the art of carving wooden horses, each one unique, each one special, each one a symbol of hope, healing, and the unbreakable bonds of family. The broken had been made whole, the lost had been found, and love, as it always does, had found a way. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new, amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.